By the High Middle Ages, the Church's war on heresy had reached a fever pitch. Catastrophic wars, the tortures of the Inquisition, and the searing flesh of relapsed heretics had begun to appear all through Western Christendom. With the Cathars nearly annihilated, the Waldensians fleeing into the mountains, and the spiritual Franciscans burned alive for their desire to follow in the poverty of Christ, the Church now set its sights on the complete destruction of the magical arts. No longer a mere sin among sins, the practice of magic was now increasingly understood as heretical diabolism, worshipping and making a pact with the forces of Satan, a theological gesture foreshadowing the early modern witch hunts. And what had been a short, in the history of the occult arts, a short flourishing of the occult arts and sciences now went into hiding, surviving for centuries in the so-called clerical necromantic underground. However, one certain magician was determined to defend his magical art from the rampaging church militant, composing one of the truly great works of Western ceremonial magic, this Honorius of Thebes, likely a very, very strategic pseudonym, argued that the church itself had become virtually possessed by Satan, and that the war against magic was itself diabolical, with popes and cardinals and bishops and priests now directly in the service of demonic forces. The magical arts, he argued, were a gift from God, by which miracles could be wrought through spiritual efficient causation. Indeed, magic was the surest art by which one could gain nothing less than the beatific vision, gazing upon the divine glory, seeing God face to face, as Moses did in this very life. This magical manual, known now typically as the Liber Juratus Honorii, or the Sworn Book of Honorius, is one of the most amazing survivals of medieval Western ceremonial magic, and directly impacted later magical systems, especially the Enochian magic revealed to Dr. John Dee and Sir Edward Kelly. Let's take a tour of this amazing magical manual, itself a protest against the suppression of magical belief. Also, this episode is a collaboration with my dear friend and esteemed colleague, Dr. Angela Puka of Angela's Symposium, who I'm sure most of you know, but she'll be exploring the role of the Sworn Book in the contemporary grimoire revivalism and in contemporary magical practice. So you'll definitely want to check out her content and her channel. Make sure to subscribe and support her amazing work in the study of academic esotericism. But also, if you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my other content on topics in esotericism. And also, if you want to support my work of providing episodes like this, accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube for free, I'd hope you consider supporting my work over at my Patreon with a one-time donation with PayPal. You can use the super thanks option. You can even pick up some cool black metal style merch, including a clerical necromantic underground black metal style t-shirt over at the store tab of the channel. So check those out and support the channel any way you like, even just watching the video. I appreciate it. But now let's turn to the Sworn Book of Honorius. I would suggest perhaps the most impressive textbook of ceremonial magic to survive the ravages of time and the fires of the Inquisition. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. The practice of magic has been demonized for so long in Western Christian world that it's difficult to imagine a time when, while not exactly encouraged, I must admit, magical practice was slightly more tolerated. Magical texts were openly translated through royal subsidies, and a culture where Jewish, Islamic, and Christian occult arts and sciences actually flourished together did exist for a brief period. Despite the long suppression of magic, the imprint of this period is still clearly detectable in virtually all the magical texts that have come down to us. Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, and various other Greek magical words abound. The astral magic of the Islamic world can be found in these texts, especially in how Pseudo-Al-Kindi's theory of the stellar rays underwrote basically all medieval European theories of magical causation. The construction of talismans, even the word talismans, not to mention the word alchemy, the power of divine speech and angelic causation via divine names that derive ultimately from Jewish magic, along with the magical technologies of things like the Christian Mass and exorcism rituals, remain fused in the incredibly complex corpus of the magical texts that have come down to us through the centuries. This development of magical theory and practice seems to have flourished in northern Spain, especially Catalonia, and southern France until around the 13th century, where the Inquisition saw to the end of that. This would also be the same time and place, basically, that would give birth to the Jewish Kabbalah, European alchemy, and the dualist Christianity that may have been Catharism. However, as I mentioned, none of this was to last. Papal and secular wars against so-called heretics in the Languedoc, the conquest of Al-Andalus by fundamentalist Almohads, then the religious imperialism of the Reconquista, and the rise of Aristotelian rationalism all created an environment increasingly hostile to the occult arts, especially magic, as you can imagine, with the full-blown war on heresy inaugurated by Pope Innocent III, the institutionalization of the Inquisition by Pope Gregory IX, and then finally the nail in the coffin, the explicit theological linkage of magic with diabolical sorcery by Pope John the 22nd. With all of this, the stage was set for the official and the sustained suppression and prosecution of the magical arts and the burning of its practitioners, not to mention the early modern witch hunts that are coming down the pike. But not without at least there being one magical protest before fleeing underground for centuries. Somewhere in this period of the increased and sustained persecution of magic, the anonymous author of the Liber Juratus Honorii, or the Sworn Book of Honorius, penned the text as both a thumb in the eye of what he took to be a demonically inspired church, but also that the best of this magical technology could at least survive underground. Better to survive underground than be obliterated. And in some important senses, this medieval author has won the day. And this library, this video, and probably to some degree many of your spiritual practices are all proof that they won. The practice of magic, not its violent suppression, has now carried the day. The text we now mostly know as the Liber Juratus Honorii, or the Sworn Book of Honorius, is also variously known as the Liber Sacra Liber Juratus, the Holy and Sworn Book, the Sacred Book of the Angels, and maybe, possibly, the Liber Sacratus, or the Consecrated Book. Dating the text, assuming that it was always just one text, has proven very difficult with a range of between 1100 to 1350, with now most scholars preferring a dating somewhere in the early 14th century, though that's not at all conclusive. Around circa 1230, there was a condemnation of a Liber Sacratus by William of Auvergne, which may refer to the Sworn Book or perhaps an early form of it, though a more reliable entry point into history is sometime around 1346-1347 with the trial of Olivia Pepin. Our earliest surviving manuscripts of the text also appeared during this period as well, the 1340s, with the southern recension of the book represented by the 1346 Summa Sacrae Magici of the Catalan scholar Berengario Ganel, and then the northern recension represented by Sloane 3854, also produced sometime in the mid to early 14th century. So 14th century seems to be where the manuscripts and the first trial records of the text seem to originate. The text itself survives in about 7 manuscripts, most of which are held in England. The others are actually held in Germany, and the historical translations represent this distribution as well, with the text surviving in Latin, that was certainly the language of its original composition, along with an extant English and German translations in various degrees of completeness. Sloan Manuscript 313 is also of some extra interest, at least for the folks who I'm sure are watching this episode, in that it was owned by John Dee, and it probably referenced directly in the early angelic conversations. It was also, interestingly enough, owned by poet and playwright Ben Jonson. I think it says, "I am Ben Jonson's book" at the bottom of one of the leaves. However, none of these texts appear totally complete, and I'll come back to in a minute what these lacunae represent and what separates the different recensions, the northern and southern recensions, in just a moment. The text itself seems to contain three distinct sections. One for the construction of the sigil, or the seal of the living and true God. Another detailing an elaborate process by which to induce a beatific vision, or a vision of God, the divine, face to face while still alive. And a final section detailing how to summon various supernatural beings, or daimones, or angels and demons, depending on how you want to cash those out, to accomplish various magical tasks. It's possible that the book that we have now was actually originally two separate texts. One for inducing the beatific vision, the second for constructing the seal of God, along with the various daimonic conjurations that seem to primarily use that seal. However, the text as we have it, the Liber Juratus as it has now come down to us, in both recensions is thoroughly fused, so it is a complete systematic work at this point. The author of the text is pseudo-anonymous, but the prologue of the text found in the northern but not in the southern recension, and thus it might actually date from a slightly later period, perhaps to the papal authority of John the 22nd, the anti-magic pope, and it provides the backdrop for the preparation of the book itself. The prologue details how a council of 89 magicians from Naples and Athens and Toledo, all facing a demonically inspired church seeking to destroy the art of magic, met and elected Honorius, son of Euclid, like that Euclid probably, of Thebes to preserve the art. Working with the angel Hokroel, probably a corruption of the Hebrew Chochmael, or the wisdom of God, they extracted 93 chapters from 7 big books of magic as the flower of all hitherto magical practice. With that book complete, the magical masters swore a series of oaths, ensuring a careful, secret chain of transmission of the art contained within the book. With the book completed, the magical masters swore a series of oaths, ensuring a careful, secret chain of transmission of the art contained within the book, and those 93 chapters, compiled by Honorius of Thebes and consecrated by the angel, were thus vouchsafed by the solemn oaths, and it became known as the Liber Juratus Honorii. Makes perfectly good sense, the Sworn Book of Honorius. Now, the only other place that a magically inclined Honorius seems to appear in the literature is in Trithemius's Polygraphia, where a Theban alphabet is attributed to him. Now, that's a little weird given that the Thebes in question is not the Egyptian Thebes, it's Greek Thebes, and that the alphabet that Trithemius gives is a substitution cipher for the Latin alphabet and not the Greek one. But, okay. Regardless, that alphabet would be reproduced in Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy and would go on to wide use as a kind of, general occult alphabet, especially in contemporary witchcraft practices, where it gets reproduced in various popular witchcraft books, like I think Buckland's Introduction to Witchcraft. Following that prologue, which again might be a later accretion to the text as it seems to echo a lot of the language more typical of the period of Pope John the 22nd, is a kind of table of contents. That's very deceptive. These topics are only sometimes directly covered by the text, but I suppose they could be accomplished through the various daimonic conjurations that are to be found in the later parts of the book. So it looks like a table of contents, but it's really not. In fact, the order of these texts as we have them might be all the result of a later redaction, with the seal of God originally being found at the end of the text rather than at the beginning as we have it now. I think that orientation is pretty reasonable. But that said, let's walk through the text as we have it in the northern recension. our best attested edition, especially in Sloan manuscript 3854. Following the oath and the, pseudo table of contents, the first section is a secondary prologue or a kind of introduction. It informs us that this magic has its ultimate origin in the revelation of the practice to King Solomon, thus putting us squarely in the Solomonic magical tradition, and especially of their angelology and demonology. They rely on the system of Pseudo-Dionysius, although they do shift some of the angelic groups around. The cherubim are now above the seraphim for some reason, and the principalities are now before the powers, which, again, strange. We learn that these angels serve only God and cannot be summoned by any magus, so the angels are basically all off limits. However, 3 other types of beings can be summoned: the secondary celestial or planetary entities, the aerial, and the terrestrial entities can be, and details about how to, do that represent the second part of the book. Further, we're told that the art of magic is possible because the human soul was formed with angelic aid, making us a bit angel-like, and thus able to enjoin angelic powers, summon various spirits, and see the divine face to face, just as the angels do. But, of course, only if you're Christian and Catholic. Specifically only if you're Catholic. Pagans, of course, make sacrifices only to the aerial and earthly spirits who simply trick them into idolatry. Jews, they only have power to do a little bit of conjuration, but they lost most of that when Jesus showed up. While they can summon some spirits, we're told that the spirits don't really answer them truthfully anymore, as they aren't compelled to do so. Why? Because Jews lack the power of faith in the Messianic Christ, so the spirits mostly just muck about with them. Interestingly, in the southern recension of the text, it's not pagans and Jews, but Muslims that the text seems to heap shade upon, perhaps pointing to a Reconquista context. So, an interesting difference between the northern and southern recensions. But again, this magic is for pious Catholics only. And by pious Catholics, I mean super duper hyper pious Catholics, with a literal priest buddy that you'll need to do this magic with you, like that pious. You'll need to be able to get a priest to do this with you. If you're not Catholic enough to ask a priest to risk their life for you to do this magic, then you're not Catholic enough. Following that second prologue or introduction of the text is the creation of the seal of the true and living God, a magical sigil of tremendous power, perhaps the most powerful sigil in existence from the point of view of this magical school. This series of circles, interlocking hexagons with a central pentagram, is populated with various divine names in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, among with names we don't really fully understand. The outer circumference itself is composed of an abbreviated 72-letter name of God, one of several versions of the elaborated or spoken version of the name of God that are described in the text. This 72-letter divine name is composed of the first letters of 72 other divine names, which are eventually separated into 8 groups of 9 letters, not otherwise enumerated as such in the text, though there is another list of 100 divine names that does include some of them. Again, the relationship between these lists is a bit complicated, and again, some of these are in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and some of them are otherwise totally unknown and mysterious. Now, those 8 new divine words go on to function as new divine names in themselves. These divine names function, a bit like linguistic divine fractals with nested names within names. This geometric design is to be drafted or written upon virgin parchment, that of a calf, a foal, or a deer, all interestingly kosher animals, written in the consecrated blood of a mole, a turtle dove, a hopi, or a bat. All very unkosher things, but these elements do strike one. The blood of the hopi specifically strikes one as kind of similar to Picatrix-like rituals. Now, this isn't the only use of a Shem HaMepharash used in the text either. Another set of 7 other divine names is also used for conjuring spirits, especially aerial spirits later in the text, and that list seems to potentially be derivative from the Sefer Raziel. However, this seal is central to the magic of the Sworn Book, despite the description of its construction and its historical illustrations of it all being pretty inconsistent from manuscript to manuscript. Regardless, such divine sigils or Solomonic sigils go all the way back to antiquity and legends, and without doubt, this sigil has become the most recognized element of the magic of the Sworn Book via the mystical adventures of Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly. As you may recall from my episode on the earliest angel magic, the earliest angelic magical system, the Heptarchia Mystica, the angels insisted that Dee and Kelly make use of a divine sigil to be found in one of the many tomes of Dee's occult library during their scrying sessions. One of those texts was probably Sloane 313 of the Sworn Book, along with several other manuscripts of the Sworn Book. Dee, however, was a careful observer and reader of these texts and realized that there were inconsistencies in the manuscripts for the construction of the sigil, and the angels opted for a radical shift. The revelation of a totally new sigil, the Sigillium Deus Emeth, that we have all seen on every Enochian magic book you've ever picked up. Thus, the Enochian sessions have as their jumping off point at least one of the copy, probably at least two copies of the Sworn Book, the manuscripts of which survive down to this day. Of course, that sigil would continue to mutate and change, and versions of it and derivatives versions of it have appeared in magical manuals and grimoires all the way down through to today. One might even argue that the circle pentacle of modern witchcraft or Wicca and the inverted version of the Satanic Church are somehow all ultimately downstream of the Sworn Book. The rest of the text, however, has been less influential for reasons that will become pretty quickly pretty obvious. It's really difficult to pull off the magic of the Sworn Book of Honorius. Following the construction of the seal of the true and living God, the text now shifts to what is perhaps its most defining feature, an elaborate ritual for inducing a beatific vision, beholding the divine face to face while still alive. Now, there are a few interesting theological aspects to this discussion of inducing a beatific vision before turning to the practical side of the doing of it. The first is that this text is now wading into theologically contested waters, as the question of when one was allowed to have the beatific vision was quite debated in the Middle Ages. Arguments were made that it was possible while alive, at least for certain mystics, or immediately after death for those who died in grace, or as John the 22nd had it for a while, only after the final judgment. Now that was a very controversial position that he ultimately repudiated shortly before his own death. I mean, maybe he wanted to slide into home base there at the very end. I mean, this was even repudiated by the theologians at the University of Paris. The Sworn Book is absolutely daring in this regard. Not only could you accomplish the vision while alive, but you could induce it. You could force it, in a sense. And that's a big, big, big theological no-no. Why? Because it's like forcing God to come to your party. You can't do that. No one can compel an omnipotent being to do anything, no matter what kind of fancy pants magic you got. So it wouldn't be surprising if William of Auvergne was actually referring to the Sworn Book when he heaped the most extreme scorn on the text that he referred to as the Liber Sacratus. I think it might have been the Sworn Book. The notion of using magic to compel a beatific vision, it does strike one as, well, patently heretical. But this book's all kind of like, sorry, not sorry, and just gets straight down to telling you how to do it. Now, I'm not going to go step by step through the entire extremely elaborate ritual. That's what's called read the book for your own damn self. But suffice to say, the bulk of the Sworn Book is composed of various prayers, litanies, and psalm-like texts. And in this way, it's a bit like like an occult book of hours, if you're familiar with that genre, which are recited over a 72-day period, though in the Southern Ascension it's 40 days. Both of these are numerically significant periods of time, 40 being the fasting time of Jesus and 72 being, 72. But it includes periods of fasting, penance, purification, meditation, and lots of going to Mass. Following an initial purification, the first 3 days are spent in Mass, in prayer, and in fasting in preparation for an angelic vision, which will reveal whether or not one should proceed through the rest of the ritual. you might need further purifications or penance, and you might need to start the process over briefly. If you get the angelic green light in a dream, the next 17 days or so are continued with further shifts in the fasts, additional prayers from the Sworn Book, and again continued daily masses and the consumption of the Eucharist. With this completed, another set of prayers are then initiated, which follow upon the 100 names of God. In addition, the priests officiating the Mass must be sympathetic to you at this point, because certain prayers from the Sworn Book of Honorius must be inserted into the Eucharistic ritual itself. This is not exactly a run-of-the-mill request. In fact, it seems crazy to request a priest to do magic with you, but that's how it has to be. Now, the magus retreats now to an increasingly isolated location, with further fasting and prayers now, including some biblical psalms, now praying 3 times a day for the final 7 days of the ritual. On the final evening of the ritual, the prayer pattern is continued, but now a bed of straw is prepared. The magus is ritually washed in cold spring water. He puts on a flesh-mortifying hair shirt, and then covered with black robes before following at Vespers. He retires for one final, extremely elaborate prayer, and you go to sleep. Well, if it all works out, the magus will be given a vision of the celestial palace, the majesty of the divine glory. You'll get to witness the 9 orders of the angels, in that weird order that Honorius has them, I suppose, and then you'll get to hang out with the company of the spirits of the blessed. Done and done. Now, lots can be said here, but I'll point out just 2 things. The first has to do with the fact that the various prayers the magus must recite. Recall that the text is represented by a southern and a northern recension. These 2 recensions are most recognizable by the difference in the prayers they make use of through this various cycle of rituals that help to induce this vision. The southern recension typically makes use of a set of 50 or so prayers from a text that it calls the Liber Animarum, or the Book of the 3 Spirits, that's preserved only in the 1346 Summa Sacra Magici. The northern recension, however, draws its prayers, or at least some of its prayers, from the glossed version of the Ars Notoria, often in the asemic lingua mystica of that text. Now, you may recall from my episode on the Ars Notoria that this text is composed of mystical noti, by which the magus could gain rapid knowledge of the liberal arts by meditating upon and doing a lot of other elaborate rituals. But the text also includes long strings of apparent asemic psalm-like texts. These also function as prayers in the Sworn Book, although I have to admit they're often kind of haphazardly edited into the text sometimes. Now, why there are 2 sets of prayers isn't at all clear, but it's very possible that the Liber Animarum actually represents the older stratum of the text, with the Ars Notoria insertions often being, again, pretty oddly inserted within the text of the Sworn Book. Though, the Ars Notoria sections with their asemic, gibberish-like nature, does give the text a more magical quality, whatever that means. Well, I guess unless you're a hardcore Catholic, like you should be, the Book of 3 Spirits makes it more Catholic-y. At any rate, secondly, the language of the celestial palaces used in this text, the role of ritual purity, as well as the incubation sleep vision as part of the promised beatific vision, they're actually all strangely reminiscent of Jewish Hechelot Merkava mysticism, which had, interestingly enough, only entered into Europe from the Near East around the time of the composition of the Sworn Book. This might also help get us around the charge of heresy for inducing a mystical vision. Merkava texts don't induce the divine to visit upon the magus, but they propel the magus into the throne room of the divine, though only if they've very carefully, and I mean very carefully, prepared for that journey. Thus, the Sworn Book might be a Christian remix of Jewish Merkava mysticism, at least in goal, if not in form. However, and like much Jewish magic more generally, once the vision of the divine is had, this opens the door to a wider range of magical powers, specifically via the conjuration of various spirits that in fact occupy the next section of the book. As I mentioned, the subsequent sections involve the conjuration of various daemones, or spirits, and are in a very strong way contingent upon having mastered the rituals associated with the beatific vision. You can't just skip to the conjurations, really. You got to really master the beatific vision part first. About half of the beatific vision rituals are actually purifications, which are required for the conjurations of the daemones, thus explaining the somewhat lopsided distribution of the text between the two different ceremonial feats. It's just that the second part relies a great deal on the first part of the book. Further, these rely on a rather idiosyncratic cosmology unique in some ways to the Sworn Book. Following those purifications, along with some others, including shaving off all the hair from one's body, which might again be an Islamic nod, the magus must now decide which type of being is going to be appropriate to summon for their ends. The non-angelic celestial spirits, or planetary spirits, recall that the angels, they serve God alone, they're not going to muck about with you. These are actually planetary spirits. The lower aerial spirits, or the terrestrial spirits, you got to figure out which ones you want to summon, though the terrestrial spirits are generally frowned upon because they're kind of demons. The celestial or planetary spirits are typically good to human beings. The aerial are a mix of good and evil. The author of the Sworn Book here actually repudiates the church's position that all sublunar spiritual creatures are evil. So take that, medieval church dogma. While the terrestrial spirits are, like I said, pretty much demons as we might understand them, they're mostly associated with doing malevolent things, or at least base things. Various altars are constructed at various altitudes for the representative entities that one might conjure. An elevated mound for the celestial ones, closer up toward the heavens. A surface level one for the aerials, though I will come back to this in a minute, with a lot of pomp and ceremony for the aerial beings, and a circular pit dug into the ground for the terrestrial spirits, along with appropriate suffumigations, pearls for the celestials, a very elaborate incense for the aerial spirits, and, well, sulfur for the terrestrial ones. The seal of the true and living God is often held aloft, along with numerous invocations, which are repeated over and over again for various iterations until the spirits appear or fail to appear. The invocation of the celestial or the planetary spirits is the perhaps most straightforward in many ways, though no less rigorous, and involves a specific couple of magical circles. The conjuration of the aerial spirits is by far the most complex, requiring a completion of the first 14 days of the beatific vision ritual, then further days of unique rituals involving magical wands, 7 swords. You can even hire like 7 of your buddies to help you with this. Another set of divine names written upon the ground, then erased the following day, and then written again. You can have your choice of meat and fish and wine through the ritual. The text even recommends drinking some of that wine as Dutch courage if you freak out, given the conjuration of the aerial spirits who are terrifying. You need a candle of virgin wax. You got to get a special whistle. There are specific planetary seals, which aren't provided in the book, though they do appear in manuscript R, but those are actually taken from the Heptameron of Pseudo Albano. You can watch an episode about the Heptameron. And after multiple elaborate rituals, the aerial spirits will appear, but they still must be compelled to obey. Interestingly, the conjurations of the aerial spirits take the form of indirect addresses to the spirits. Where is the spirit of so-and-so? Where is the spirit of so-and-so? And that's taken by scholars like Gershom Scholem to be derivative of the Islamic magical tradition. Again, an echo of the magical cosmopolitan world, probably from which the Sworn Book emerged. At any rate, with all the swords and wands and incense and circumambulations and tapping on the swords with the wands and invocations and all this ritual has my vote for wanting to see it recreated. I would love to see someone do this ritual in person. I mean, I'd stand over there, but I'd love to see it. I mean, this would make an absolute amazing sequence in a movie. You could even have a kind of like groovy 1980s action montage showing various parts of it all coming together. It just has to be the most elaborate medieval ritual to have survived, and the theatrics and the pomp, they really fire my imagination. So here's my vote for the conjuration of the aerial spirits if you want to make a movie with a cool magical scene. Finally, there is a very brief ritual described for summoning the foul terrestrial spirits, a practice we're told should not really be performed by Christians at all, but here it is, just for funsies. I love how he includes it even though he says you shouldn't do it. It's a similar array of purifications and invocations performed. However, again, as I mentioned, the altar for these spirits is sunk into a pit into which another magical circle is made within it. The suffumigation for the terrestrial spirits is sulfur, literal fire and brimstone. Given that these spirits are not just terrifying like the aerial spirits, but also just horrible to gaze upon, it's actually possible to write one's request upon tile with charcoal, then leave it in the pit rather than having these spirits visibly appear to you because they're terrifying and horrible to look at. Now, these base spirits deal with the more base aspects of life, including finding treasure. Because I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of treasure. The final part of this text is a kind of appendix with various texts, including the consecration for the ink for writing out the sigil of God, various further prayers for how to make the magical whistle, Ocarina of Time vibes, and a final benediction marking the text as more or less fully preserved. Indeed, only prayer 11 goes unused in the whole text, and with the exception of the planetary sigils, which, again, you can kind of get those from the Heptameron or other ceremonial texts of the time, like CLM 849, all of which might seem to share a common origin in Byzantine ritual magic, so you can get the planetary sigils from those texts. The Sworn Book is very nearly complete, and it is not just complete, but extremely systematic. And given just how theologically radical it is, the inducing of a beatific vision while alive, if asleep, its open declaration that the Church's condemnation of magic is itself demonically motivated, all the while being a systematic manual for the summoning of various spirits, including what are basically demonic terrestrial forces. All of this taken together makes the survival of this text all the more impressive. I mean, miraculous even. And honestly, we can thank John Dee. Thank you, John Dee, in large part for his role in rescuing and preserving these kinds of texts, often at great peril to himself. I hope I've been able to impress upon you that the Liber Juratus Honorii, or the Sworn Book of Honorius, is truly one of the standout texts in the history of medieval ritual magic, but also I would argue in all of the Western magical tradition combined. I'm excited that after proving obscure for most of the 20th century, just gets a relatively short mention here in Thorndike, it's finally receiving extensive scholarly treatment in a variety of studies over the past 15 or 20 years. There are now 2 critical editions that have emerged in recent years by Baudet and Herdegard, along with detailed studies in the Penn State series on the history of magic, along with other publications by Fenger and Kiekeffer and Klassen, Matheson, Messler, Page, Veenstra, and others have greatly and deepened our understanding of this hugely important text. You can check out their studies in the description if you want to get really deep into studying the Sworn Book. Of course, this is also an opportunity for me to express my gratitude, Joseph Peterson, for publishing the first online edition of the text that you could actually get access to, but also preparing the best English translation of the text in print. Now, if you want to study these texts, its ritual and its imagery, your best bet is to get one of the critical editions. Make sure to get Joseph Peterson's edition, and then dive into this amazing text. Our understanding of the origins of Western ceremonial magic are still in their infancy, but the Liber Juratus Honorii, or the Sworn Book of Honorius, I argue will prove decisive in both the history and trajectory of magic in theory and practice. Again, make sure to check out Dr. Puka's companion episode, especially on how the Sworn Book has functioned into contemporary grimoire traditionalism and grimoire revivalism. Her channel is amazing. Make sure to check it out. More magic to come. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge. Thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. And treasure.